Chapter 1. Return to Wintermere. The train to Wintermere rattled along its tracks, cutting through a landscape blanketed in pristine snow. Outside the frost-kissed window, the world seemed to glow under the pale December sun, its light casting long shadows over the rolling hills and frozen lakes. Katie Hayes pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her fingers curling around the warm ceramic cup of coffee she had barely touched. It had been 8 years since she had last set foot in Wintermere, the town where she had spent her childhood winters, wrapped in the scent of cinnamon and pine, where the town square twinkled with golden lights and laughter echoed through cobblestone streets. But this time, she wasn't returning for a holiday filled with warmth and joy. She was returning to say goodbye. Her grandmother's passing had left a void in her heart, one that even the passage of time could not soften. The old Victorian house, nestled at the edge of town, now belonged to her, an inheritance she wasn't sure she was ready for. Wintermere was a place frozen in memory, untouched by the years, but she had changed. She wasn't the dreamy girl who had once believed in wishes and fairy tales. She was an astrophysicist now, a woman who spent her days mapping the stars and finding answers in equations, not in old legends whispered by firelight. The train lurched as it pulled into the station, and Katie exhaled slowly, watching as the steam curled against the cold air. Grabbing her suitcase, she stepped onto the platform, where a gust of winter wind greeted her like an old friend. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled her lungs, awakening something deep within her, a nostalgia she wasn't ready to confront. "Miss Hayes." She turned at the sound of her name. A man in a thick wool coat and scarf stood near the station entrance, his expression polite but unreadable. "I'm Thomas Becker," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Your grandmother's lawyer. I was asked to ensure you arrived safely." Katie shook his hand, nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Becker. I appreciate it." "Please, call me Thomas," he said with a small smile. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. She spoke of you often." The words settled heavily in her chest. "She was," Katie agreed softly. "It still doesn't feel real." Thomas nodded, as if understanding. "I have all the legal documents ready for you, but I thought you might want to settle in first. The house has been kept warm for you. And there's something else. Something she left behind for you specifically." Katie raised an eyebrow. "Something else?" He hesitated. "She left a letter, but I think you should read it at the house." A flicker of unease stirred within her, but she nodded. "All right." The drive through Wintermere was like stepping back in time. The town square was already dressed for Christmas, with garlands draped across shop fronts and lanterns casting a golden glow on the snow-covered streets. The celestial pine stood tall at the center, its branches heavy with twinkling lights, just as she remembered it. The town's oldest legend claimed that on Christmas Eve, those who made a wish beneath its boughs would have their heart's truest desire granted. As a child, she had believed in its magic. Now, she knew better. When they arrived at the house, Katie hesitated at the gate. The old Victorian home loomed before her, its familiar wraparound porch dusted with snow. The sight of it sent a pang through her chest. "You'll find the letter inside," Thomas said gently. "Take your time." She managed a nod before stepping onto the porch. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and the scent of aged wood, vanilla, and something faintly floral welcomed her like a ghost of the past. Setting her suitcase down, Katie glanced around. The house was untouched, as though her grandmother had only stepped out for a moment. And then, on the entryway table, she saw it, a letter sealed in deep blue wax, her name written in familiar, flowing script. Hands trembling, she picked it up and broke the seal. The paper was soft with age, the ink dark against the cream-colored parchment. "My dearest Katie, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. But know that my love surrounds you always. There is something I have long wished to tell you, a secret kept for generations. You may not believe it, but I ask that you listen with an open heart. There is magic in Wintermere, real magic. And it all begins with a wish. Katie's breath hitched. She read the words again, her pulse quickening. A sharp wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Magic? No, it was just a story, a legend. And yet, as she stood there in the quiet house, a strange feeling curled in her chest, something both familiar and unknown, something that whispered of the impossible. Outside, the celestial pines swayed in the wind, its lights flickering like stars in the night sky. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Wintermere, something was waiting for her. Something or someone. Chapter 2. The Celestial Pine's Secret. Katie's fingers trembled as she clutched the letter, her grandmother's words echoing in her mind. There is magic in Wintermere, real magic. And it all begins with a wish. She exhaled sharply and set the letter down, running a hand through her hair. This was absurd. Magic wasn't real. It was a comforting fairy tale, a whisper of wonder passed down through generations. A story told to children on cold winter nights. And yet, her gaze drifted to the frost-lined window. The celestial pine stood tall in the town square, its branches heavy with twinkling lights, flickering like distant constellations. She had spent so many childhood winters beneath that tree, staring up at its brilliance, believing in its legend. But those days were long gone. A sudden gust of wind rattled the house, and Katie shivered. Pushing away the strange unease creeping over her, she turned toward the staircase, deciding she needed rest. The journey had been long, and exhaustion was beginning to settle in her bones. She could deal with her grandmother's words in the morning, when everything didn't feel so eerily still. Yet, sleep didn't come easily. As she lay in her childhood bedroom, cocooned in layers of blankets, memories flooded her. Christmas mornings filled with warmth, the scent of fresh pine needles, the soft laughter of her grandmother as she told stories by the fire. And then there were the nights she had spent outside beneath the celestial pine, whispering her secret wishes to the wind. What had she wished for? Katie frowned, realization settling over her like a weight. She couldn't remember. She knew she had made wishes every year without fail, but the details were gone, vanished like breath on frosted glass. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. That was impossible. How could she forget something so significant? The clock on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m. Sighing, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, knowing sleep wouldn't return anytime soon. Maybe a walk would clear her mind. Throwing on her coat, she stepped out into the crisp night air. The town was silent, the only sound the crunch of her boots against the fresh snow. The streets were empty, save for the soft glow of lamplights casting golden pools along the cobblestone paths. And ahead of her, in the heart of Wintermere, stood the celestial pine. Katie hesitated at the base of the towering tree, staring up into its branches. The air beneath it felt different, thicker, charged with something she couldn't explain. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the flickering lights, when movement in the shadows caught her eye. A figure stood on the other side of the tree, partially obscured by the mist curling around the snow. Katie's breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called hesitantly. The figure turned, stepping into the dim light. A man, tall, with dark hair dusted with snow, dressed in an old-fashioned coat that looked entirely out of place in the modern world. His eyes, deep and unreadable, met hers, and something inside her twisted with familiarity, though she was certain they had never met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "You came back." Katie blinked. "Excuse me." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "I've been waiting for you, Katie." Her pulse pounded in her ears. She took an instinctive step back. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, with a voice that carried the weight of something far older than the town itself, he said, "My name is Nathaniel Whitmore." The name struck something deep within her, like a bell tolling in the distance. Recognition tugged at the edges of her memory, but she couldn't grasp why. She swallowed hard, her breath forming mist between them. "I don't know you," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, though something flickered behind his eyes. Something ancient, something patient. "You did once." A gust of wind howled through the square, sending a flurry of snowflakes dancing between them. Katie shivered, though it wasn't entirely from the cold. "I think you're mistaken," she said, trying to sound firm, though her voice wavered slightly. Nathaniel simply watched her, a ghost of a smile at the corner of his lips. Perhaps. Katie didn't know why, but she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, as if everything she knew had suddenly become uncertain. A strange feeling, one she couldn't name, settled deep in her chest. She should walk away. She should go back to the house and forget this encounter ever happened. But she didn't. Instead, she found herself staring into Nathaniel Whitmore's eyes, caught in something she didn't understand. And in the silence between them, the celestial pine shimmered, its lights flickering like stars against the endless night. Chapter 3. A Wish in the Snow. The evening sky stretched endlessly above, painted in hues of deep indigo and violet, a canvas splattered with glistening stars. The distant hum of the city had faded, leaving only the whispering wind and the rhythmic pulse of Nathaniel Whitmore's heart as he stood at the edge of the old Whitmore estate. Nathaniel's fingers clenched into fists as he gazed at the towering structure before him. The house had once been a symbol of pride, a grand inheritance steeped in history, but now it stood like a decaying monument to a past he wished to forget. The ivy that had once adorned the stone walls had grown unruly, crawling over the windows like nature's attempt to reclaim what had been lost. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, its golden glow casting eerie shadows on the cobblestone path. Katie stood a few steps behind him, her breath steady but her hands trembling slightly. She had insisted on coming with him, even when he had told her that some secrets were better left buried. But Katie had always been persistent, her determination an unshakable force against the weight of his hesitations. "Nathaniel," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Are you ready?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready," he admitted, "but I have to do this." Together, they stepped forward, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound between them. Nathaniel reached for the door handle, hesitating for the briefest moment before pushing it open. The scent of aged wood and dust filled his nostrils, carrying with it the ghosts of his childhood. The dimly lit foyer welcomed them with an unsettling stillness, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for his return. Every corner of the house was a memory. The grand staircase, the long corridors, the vast library where his father used to sit for hours, poring over old manuscripts. But it was the study that held the truth he sought. Katie followed closely behind as Nathaniel led the way, his steps steady but his heart pounding. The door to the study was slightly ajar, a sight that sent an unexpected shiver down his spine. He reached out, pushing it open with careful deliberation. The room was exactly as he remembered. Heavy bookshelves lined the walls, filled with worn leather-bound volumes. The large mahogany desk sat in the center, a relic of the past covered in dust. But it was the safe embedded in the wall that drew his attention. His father had always been secretive about that safe, never allowing Nathaniel near it. He had once asked about it as a child, only to be met with a stern warning never to pry. But now, he had to know what was inside. Nathaniel stepped forward, pressing his palm against the cold metal. He had spent years deciphering the possible combination, sifting through old letters, memories, anything that might give him a clue. With a deep breath, he began to turn the dial. Click. The first number. Click. The second. Click. The final number fell into place, and with a low creak, the safe door swung open. Inside, there was no gold, no priceless heirlooms. Only a stack of letters, neatly tied together with a faded ribbon. His breath caught in his throat as he reached for them, his fingers trembling as he untied the delicate knot. Katie moved closer, peering over his shoulder as he unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was familiar, but the words made his blood run cold. "My dearest Nathaniel, there is something you must know." His pulse thundered in his ears as he read further, each word unraveling a truth more devastating than he could have imagined. The foundation of his past, the very essence of his identity, was beginning to crack, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel realized that everything he had believed was built upon a carefully crafted lie. The promise he had once made under the stars felt heavier than ever, and as he turned to Katie, he saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. "Everything's about to change," he whispered, and he knew this was only the beginning. Chapter 4: The Man from the Past. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had passed earlier in the evening. The cobbled streets of Whitmore Manor's vast estate glistened faintly under the glow of the gas lamps, their golden light flickering against the encroaching shadows of the towering oaks that lined the pathway. Katie pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as she walked, her fingers gripping the edges as if to anchor herself in the present moment. There was an unease in the air, an invisible weight pressing against her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the past few days had altered the course of her life in ways she did not yet understand. Nathaniel Whitmore stood at the edge of the grand balcony overlooking the gardens, his silhouette sharp against the dimly lit sky. He was deep in thought, his hands resting on the ornate railing, the cold metal biting into his palms. His mind replayed the conversation he had with his father earlier that evening, a conversation that left him with more questions than answers. "You must understand, Nathaniel, there are things in motion that cannot be undone," his father had said, his tone firm yet laced with an unusual softness. "You would do well to prepare yourself." Prepare himself for what? The words echoed in his mind like a distant whisper, taunting him with their vagueness. He exhaled slowly, watching as his breath curled into the night air like a ghostly wisp before vanishing into the darkness. Katie reached the steps leading up to the balcony, hesitating for a moment before ascending. She had seen that look in Nathaniel's eyes before, a storm raging just beneath the surface, restrained but potent. She knew him well enough to recognize when his thoughts were burdened with something he wasn't ready to share. "You'll catch a chill standing out here like that," she said gently, her voice breaking the quiet hum of the night. Nathaniel turned slightly, a small smirk touching his lips before vanishing just as quickly. "I could say the same for you." Katie exhaled a soft laugh, stepping closer. "Then perhaps we're both foolish." His gaze softened as he regarded her. There was something reassuring about her presence, a steadiness that kept him grounded even when his world felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. "Perhaps," he admitted, glancing back toward the gardens. "Or perhaps we're simply searching for answers in the same way." A silence settled between them, comfortable yet charged with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Katie had learned not to press Nathaniel when he wasn't ready to talk, but she also knew that his silences often spoke louder than his words. "Is it your father again?" she asked after a moment, her voice careful. Nathaniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "He speaks in riddles, as always. He wants me to be prepared, but for what, he won't say." He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "I don't like being kept in the dark." Katie understood that frustration all too well. There had been many times in her life when the truth had been kept from her under the guise of protection. It never made the burden any lighter. "Then maybe it's time we start looking for answers ourselves." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "And how do you propose we do that?" A slow smile spread across Katie's lips, one that spoke of quiet determination. "By not waiting for them to come to us." For the first time that evening, Nathaniel felt something other than uncertainty. He felt the pull of adventure, the spark of something unknown yet exhilarating. And with Katie by his side, he knew he would face whatever lay ahead, secrets, dangers, and the promises written in the stars above them. Chapter 5. Nathaniel's Story. Katie sat curled up in the worn armchair by the fireplace, her grandmother's old quilt wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The flames flickered, casting golden light across the cozy room, but no warmth seemed to reach the unease settling deep in her bones. Nathaniel Whitmore. The name still echoed in her mind, an insistent whisper she couldn't shake. She had barely slept, haunted by fragments of dreams that felt too real, laughter beneath the celestial pine, a boy's voice promising something, hands clasped together against the cold. But every time she tried to hold on to the memories, they dissolved into nothingness. Her grandmother's letter rested on the small wooden table beside her. The words now burned into her mind. There is magic in Windermere, real magic, and it all begins with a wish. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She had come back to Windermere to settle her grandmother's estate, to close a chapter of her life, not to unravel long-forgotten mysteries. And yet, the town seemed determined to pull her back into its stories. Or maybe it was Nathaniel. She stood abruptly, pushing aside the quilt. Avoiding the answers wouldn't make them disappear. If she wanted the truth, she had to face it head-on. Digging through her grandmother's old wooden chest, she ran her fingers over familiar relics of childhood, delicate lace doilies, aged Christmas ornaments, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. At the very bottom, her fingers brushed against something hard. She pulled it out, revealing an old iron key, cold to the touch. A shiver ran through her. This wasn't just any key. She remembered it, though she couldn't recall from where. The ornate design, the swirling patterns etched into the metal. It meant something. But what? A knock at the door made her jump. Katie hesitated before crossing the room. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouette of a tall figure, patiently waiting. Her heartbeat quickened. She opened the door, and there he was. Nathaniel Whitmore. Snowflakes clung to his dark coat, his gaze steady as he regarded her. You couldn't sleep. It wasn't a question. Katie swallowed hard. Neither could you. His lips quirked, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. I thought you might have questions. She tightened her grip on the key still clutched in her hand. You seem to have all the answers. Nathaniel exhaled, his breath forming a ghostly mist in the cold air. Not all of them, but I know where to start. His gaze dropped to her hand, and his expression darkened slightly. You found it. Katie's fingers curled around the key instinctively. You know what this is. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Yes. A chill ran down her spine. Then tell me. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. It's the key to a promise. Her breath caught. There it was again, that word. Promise. Katie stepped back, motioning for him to come inside. Nathaniel hesitated only a second before stepping over the threshold, shaking the snow from his coat. The warmth of the house did little to soften the intensity of his presence. She set the key on the table between them. Explain. Nathaniel studied her carefully, as if weighing how much to reveal. Do you believe memories can be locked away? She frowned. What do you mean? He picked up the key, turning it over in his gloved hands. Some things are forgotten naturally. Others, he met her eyes. Others are hidden. A lump formed in Katie's throat. Hidden by who? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. By you. A stunned silence stretched between them. That doesn't make sense, she said finally, shaking her head. Why would I? Because sometimes remembering is more painful than forgetting. Katie's pulse thundered in her ears. A part of her wanted to argue, to demand proof. But deep down, in a place she had long ignored, something stirred. An ache, an absence, as if she had spent years looking for something she didn't even realize was missing. She inhaled shakily. So what happens if I use the key? Nathaniel's gaze darkened. Then the past will no longer be locked away. A log crackled in the fireplace, sending a cascade of embers into the air. The small room felt impossibly still, as if the very house was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Katie stared at the key, its cool metal gleaming in the firelight. A choice lay before her: keep the door closed, or step through it and uncover whatever truth she had once chosen to forget. She looked up at Nathaniel, searching his face for certainty, for reassurance. He gave none, because this choice was hers alone to make. Chapter 6: A Love That Waited Centuries. The evening air was crisp, a gentle breeze teasing the branches of the towering oak trees that lined the Whitmore estate. Katie stood at the edge of the garden, her fingers lightly tracing the intricate designs of the wrought iron gate. It had been a week since her last encounter with Nathaniel, and though their paths had crossed in fleeting moments, there was still a distance between them, one that neither seemed willing to bridge. The quiet hum of the night was interrupted only by the distant chirp of crickets, but Katie's mind was far from peaceful. She had spent days contemplating everything that had happened between them, trying to untangle the web of emotions that Nathaniel stirred within her. She had long admired his strength, his grace, and his intelligence, but now she found herself questioning whether those qualities were enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. Katie's gaze shifted to the mansion ahead, its stone walls bathed in the soft glow of the moon. Nathaniel had invited her to join him for a walk in the garden that evening, but he had been unusually distant, his eyes clouded with thoughts he hadn't shared. It was as if there was something he wanted to say, something that hung between them, unspoken, like a fragile thread in the wind. But what was it? And why was it so hard for him to voice it? She shook her head and took a step away from the gate, her heels clicking on the stone pathway as she walked toward the ornate fountain in the center of the garden. The water danced in the air, sparkling under the moonlight, its gentle sound bringing her a sense of tranquility that she desperately needed. As she approached the fountain, she paused, feeling the familiar presence of Nathaniel beside her. He had come silently, like he always did, his footsteps barely making a sound on the gravel. His presence was a comfort and a challenge, like the calm before a storm that she could never predict. "I thought I'd find you here," Nathaniel said, his voice smooth and warm, though there was a hint of hesitation. He stood beside her, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. Katie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, studying his features in the dim light. His face was handsome, sharp in its angles, but there was a shadow in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A part of her wanted to reach out and ask him what was wrong, but another part, one that was increasingly becoming familiar, held her back. Perhaps she feared the answer. "You've been distant lately," Katie finally said, her voice soft but firm. "I can feel it. Something's not right." Nathaniel glanced down at his feet, as if trying to find the right words to say. He was silent for a moment, his breath steady but his thoughts seemingly far away. Finally, he looked up at her, his gaze intense. "I never wanted to hurt you, Katie," he said, his words laced with an emotion that she couldn't quite place. "But sometimes, the more we want something, the more we have to fight against it." Katie's heart skipped a beat. She knew the weight of those words, but they left her confused and vulnerable. "Fight against what, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though afraid of the answer. He exhaled slowly, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "What we feel," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "There's something in the way, something that neither of us can ignore. Our worlds are different, Katie. You deserve more than I can give you." Katie's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing. "But you don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't care about the worlds we come from. I care about you. And I've never once thought that the life I wanted had to fit into some perfect mold. You don't have to be perfect, Nathaniel. You just have to be you." Nathaniel closed his eyes, as though her words had struck him in a way that words alone couldn't express. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause. Then, with a swift motion, he reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers. Katie looked down at their hands, their fingers nearly touching, but not quite. The silence stretched between them like a vast ocean, both of them unsure how to cross it. "I'm afraid," Nathaniel admitted quietly, his voice barely audible over the rush of water from the fountain. "Afraid of what this means, what it could become. What if I'm not enough for you, Katie? What if I ruin everything?" Katie's eyes softened as she turned to face him fully, her heart breaking at the vulnerability in his eyes. She reached up, placing her hand on his cheek, her touch light but full of tenderness. "You're enough, Nathaniel. You've always been enough." And in that moment, the weight of their unspoken feelings seemed to shift. The distance between them felt less like an insurmountable chasm and more like a hurdle they could overcome together. Katie could see it in his eyes, the same longing, the same fear, and the same hope that had been building between them for days. Nathaniel lowered his head, his forehead touching hers, as if grounding himself in the reality of the moment. "I don't want to let you go, Katie," he murmured, his words like a promise in the night air. Katie closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep within her. "Then don't," she whispered back. "Don't let me go." For a moment, they stood there, wrapped in each other's presence, the world around them fading away. No more words were needed. The unspoken promises, the fears, and the desires were all there, suspended in the starlit night, just beyond reach. But for now, they didn't need to reach. They had each other. And for that fleeting moment, that was enough. Chapter 7, Midnight Starlight. The days that followed the quiet exchange in the garden seemed to pass in a blur. Nathaniel and Katie found themselves entangled in a delicate dance, neither of them willing to pull away, but both unsure of what the next step might bring. The quiet understanding that had settled between them was comforting, but also filled with a tension neither of them knew how to resolve. Katie spent more time at the Whitmore estate, her presence like a breath of fresh air that had long been absent. There were moments when Nathaniel would appear, standing in the doorway with that same unreadable look in his eyes, as though he was battling something within himself. Yet, when he looked at her, there was no mistaking the softness in his gaze, the way his lips would curl into a half-smile when she was near. But there were also the silences, those moments when the weight of the world seemed to press down on them both. Katie couldn't shake the feeling that Nathaniel was holding something back, something important, something that could change everything. It was on the morning of a particularly foggy day that Katie found herself standing at the edge of the garden again, the mist swirling around her like an ethereal veil. She had been wandering the estate for hours, trying to find some sense of clarity, but it had eluded her. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Nathaniel and the quiet promises they had made to each other, promises that seemed fragile in the face of the uncertainty that still lingered between them. "Are you lost?" a familiar voice asked, breaking through her reverie. Katie turned, her heart fluttering in her chest as she met Nathaniel's gaze. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his posture casual but somehow still imposing. The fog wrapped around him, making him seem like a figure from a dream. "No," she replied, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Just thinking." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's easy to get lost in here," he said softly, stepping closer. "This place has a way of hiding things." Katie raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Hiding things? Like what?" Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the distant horizon before returning to her. "Like the truth," he murmured. Katie's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that there was more to Nathaniel than what he let others see. Beneath the surface, there was a depth to him, an ocean of emotions and experiences that he kept hidden from the world. But what truth was he referring to? And why had it taken him so long to share it? She took a step toward him, her voice steady despite the flutter of uncertainty in her chest. "Nathaniel, if there's something you need to say, something that's been weighing on you, you can tell me." He glanced at her, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then, with a sigh, he dropped his gaze, as though the weight of his unspoken words was too much to bear. "I don't know how to say this, Katie," he said, his voice low and strained. I don't know if I can. Katie's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. You don't have to be afraid, Nathaniel. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. He looked up at her then, his eyes searching hers as if he was looking for something, some kind of reassurance that she would be there, no matter what. And in that moment, Katie realized that she wasn't just standing in the garden anymore. She was standing at the edge of something much bigger, something that could either bring them closer together or tear them apart. I've been running from this, from us, for a long time, Nathaniel confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I've built walls around myself, thinking that I could keep the world out, keep the hurt out. But you've made me realize that I can't keep running anymore. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. Katie stepped closer, her heart racing as she reached out to gently take his hand. You don't have to run, Nathaniel. You don't have to do this alone. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek before he wiped it away quickly, almost as if ashamed of showing any sign of weakness. I don't know how to be the man you need me to be. I don't know how to make this right. I've never been good at this, at being vulnerable, at letting someone in. Katie felt a lump form in her throat. She had known this about him, of course. Nathaniel was a man who had always carried the weight of his family's legacy, his own expectations, and the world's perception of him. But now, standing before him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, she couldn't help but feel the pull of her own heart. She had spent so much time guarding herself, protecting her own emotions. But now, she was ready to give him everything, to trust him completely. I'm not asking for perfection, Nathaniel, she said softly. I'm asking for you, for all of you, the broken, the scared, the beautiful parts. I'm not afraid of your past, of the things that haunt you. I just want to be here with you, whatever that means. He looked at her for a long moment, as though her words were slowly sinking in. Then, without warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as though afraid that if he let go, she would disappear. I don't deserve you, Katie, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But I'll spend every day trying to prove that I do. Katie closed her eyes, her arms wrapping around him as she held him just as tightly. You don't have to prove anything, Nathaniel. You're already everything I need. For a long time, they stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, the fog swirling around them, the world fading away. It was as if, in that moment, nothing else mattered. They had made a choice, one that was as uncertain as it was inevitable, a choice to face the truth together, to navigate the unknown hand in hand, no matter what came next. And though the future was still clouded with uncertainty, Katie knew one thing for sure. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her. That was enough. Chapter 8. Whispers of the Winter Wind. The days after their conversation in the garden seemed to pass with an almost surreal tranquility. The weight that had hung between them, thick with unspoken words, had finally lifted. Nathaniel and Katie found themselves navigating a new phase in their relationship, one that was uncharted and filled with both promise and uncertainty. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long while, both of them felt like they were no longer standing at the edge of a precipice. Katie had spent the past few days at the Whitmore estate, a place that was beginning to feel more like home with each passing moment. The large stone manor, once intimidating and distant, now felt warm and welcoming. She had spent hours with Nathaniel, walking through the gardens, reading together by the fire, and enjoying the rare moments of peace that life seemed to offer them. But as they had learned, peace was always fleeting. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and lavender, Katie sat on the terrace, watching the last traces of daylight fade into night. Her thoughts wandered to the future she had never imagined for herself, but one that was now beginning to feel more real with each passing day. She glanced at her phone, a gentle reminder of the life she had left behind. A series of missed messages blinked at her, most of them from her closest friends, checking in, asking when she would return. She hadn't responded yet. She didn't know how to explain this new chapter of her life, the one she was living alongside Nathaniel. Her friends wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand. Katie had always been the independent one, the one who made her own path. But now, with Nathaniel by her side, that path was suddenly uncertain. She had thought she knew what her future looked like. She had always been so sure. But now, there was a new kind of uncertainty, a new kind of question that had settled deep in her chest. "Are you all right?" Nathaniel's voice broke through her thoughts, soft and reassuring, as he stepped onto the terrace and took a seat beside her. Katie turned her gaze to him, surprised at how effortlessly he had become a part of her life. A few months ago, the idea of sharing such intimate moments with him would have seemed impossible. But now, with his presence so constant, it felt almost natural. "I'm fine," Katie said, offering him a small smile. "Just thinking." Nathaniel's eyes softened, and for a moment, he studied her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I can see that, but I don't think you're fine. I think you're thinking about something you don't want to face." Katie let out a small laugh, surprised at how well he could read her. "Maybe you're right, but I don't even know where to start." Nathaniel reached out and gently took her hand, his touch grounding her. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Katie. I don't either." Katie squeezed his hand, feeling a flicker of hope rise within her. "It's just that this life, this world we've built together, it's so different from what I expected. It's so different from everything I've known. I don't know if I can keep up with it, Nathaniel. I don't know if I'm strong enough for what's coming." Nathaniel turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. "I know it's not what you expected. It's not what I expected either. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. We don't have to have everything figured out. We just have to take it one step at a time." Katie looked into his eyes, the sincerity in them making her heart ache. She had spent so many years building walls around herself, hiding from the things that scared her, the things that could break her. But now, with Nathaniel, she found herself wanting to tear those walls down, wanting to trust in something greater than fear, greater than the uncertainty of the future. "I'm scared," she admitted softly, the vulnerability in her voice making her feel exposed. "I'm scared of what the future might bring, of what I might lose. But more than that, I'm scared of losing you." Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers, his voice low and steady. "You won't lose me, Katie. I'll be right here, every step of the way. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." For a long moment, Katie said nothing. She let his words settle over her, feeling their weight and their truth. She had never been someone who relied on anyone else. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. But with Nathaniel, she was beginning to understand that true strength didn't come from standing alone. It came from standing together, supporting one another, and facing the world as one. "I'm ready," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and freeing. "I'm ready to face whatever comes next with you. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to find out, with you." Nathaniel smiled then, a genuine, heartfelt smile that made Katie's chest tighten with emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll figure it out together, Katie. We always will." As the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, the two of them sat in silence, their hands intertwined, both of them looking toward a future that was still uncertain but somehow brighter than it had been before. For the first time, Katie felt the weight of her fear begin to lift, replaced by a new sense of possibility. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, no doubt, but she was no longer facing them alone. And that, more than anything, gave her the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in her life, Katie was ready to walk it, by Nathaniel's side, no matter where it led. Chapter 9. The Hidden Letter. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Katie found herself standing in front of the grand library in the Whitmore estate, her heart a heavy knot in her chest. Nathaniel had been unusually distant the past few days, his mind seemingly occupied with something she couldn't understand. His quiet demeanor, his pensive silences. It was as if there was something he was struggling to carry, something he was hiding from her. The fog of uncertainty had returned, wrapping around her thoughts, clouding the clarity she had felt just days before. Katie had thought, perhaps foolishly, that they had reached a place where they could face whatever came their way together. But now, as she stood in front of the towering shelves of books, surrounded by the vast knowledge and history of the Whitmore family, she realized that there was still so much about him she didn't know. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the library, the scent of aged leather and paper filling the air. She found Nathaniel standing by the large window that overlooked the estate's gardens. His back was turned to her, his posture tense, his gaze lost in the distance. Nathaniel didn't turn around as she entered, but she could feel the change in the atmosphere, a shift that made her chest tighten. It was as though he had become a stranger to her again, someone she didn't recognize, someone she couldn't reach. Nathaniel. Katie's voice was tentative, barely above a whisper, as she took a few steps toward him. What's going on? Why are you shutting me out? For a long moment, there was no response. The silence between them felt like a heavy weight, suffocating the air, making it hard for Katie to breathe. She had never imagined that their relationship would come to this, standing on opposite sides, separated by the very thing that had brought them together in the first place, their shared feelings for each other. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice low and distant. I'm not shutting you out, Katie. I'm trying to figure things out. I don't want to drag you into my mess. Katie's heart sank at the words. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving him. You're not dragging me into anything, Nathaniel. I want to be here with you, whatever it is. But I can't help you if you won't let me in. He turned around slowly, his gaze meeting hers for the first time in days. There was something in his eyes, something raw, something torn, that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked lost. It's not that simple, he said quietly. There are things I have to do, things I've kept hidden for so long. I thought I could handle them on my own, but now I see that I can't. And the last thing I want to do is bring you into it. Katie shook her head, her frustration and confusion rising. Nathaniel, you don't have to handle everything on your own. Not anymore. We're a team. We've always been a team. Whatever it is, we can face it together. He looked away, his jaw tightening. This isn't something you can fix, Katie. It's bigger than that. The words stung, though she tried not to show it. So, you think I'm not strong enough to help you? To be there for you? Her voice cracked slightly, the vulnerability seeping through despite her best efforts to remain composed. Nathaniel's eyes softened, regret flashing across his face. No, that's not what I meant. I don't want to bring you down with me. I don't want you to be caught in the fallout of something I should have dealt with years ago. Katie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Nathaniel, you don't get it. I don't care what it is, or how long it's been. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And if you think you can handle it alone, you're wrong. You're never alone, not with me. For a long time, Nathaniel didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring at her with a conflicted expression, as if he were trying to decide whether to trust her, whether to let her in. It hurt more than Katie had expected to see him like this, so distant, so afraid to let her see the parts of himself he had been hiding. Then, slowly, he walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. When he stopped in front of her, he reached out, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. His touch was soft, almost tentative, as if he were afraid she might pull away. I never wanted to hurt you, Katie, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I can't keep pretending that I have everything under control. There's a part of me, so much of me, that's broken. And I don't know if I can ever fix it. I don't know if I can ever be the man you deserve. Katie's heart ached at his words, but instead of pulling away, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes for a moment to steady herself. I don't need you to be perfect, Nathaniel. I just need you to be honest with me. We can face whatever it is, together. I'm not going anywhere. A tear slipped down his cheek, and Katie's breath hitched as she watched him struggle to maintain his composure. Nathaniel Whitmore, the man who had always seemed so strong, so untouchable, was finally breaking in front of her. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Scared that I'll lose you. Scared that I'm not enough. That I'll drag you down with me and ruin everything. Katie placed her hand over his, pressing it to her heart. You're not going to lose me, Nathaniel. Not now, not ever. We're in this together, and I'm not going anywhere. For a moment, they simply stood there, their foreheads touching, their hearts beating in sync. The weight of everything that had been left unsaid was finally being lifted, piece by piece. The walls that Nathaniel had built around himself were beginning to crumble, and Katie was right there beside him, holding the pieces together. I don't know what the future holds, Nathaniel murmured, his breath warm against her skin. But I know that I want you in it. Whatever it takes. Katie's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, her chest full of warmth and love. Then we'll take it one day at a time. Together. Nathaniel nodded, his hand gently cupping her cheek as he kissed her forehead, sealing their unspoken promise. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they had each other. And for now, that was enough. As they stood there in the quiet of the library, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, together, finally ready to face whatever came next. Chapter 10. Chasing the Unbelievable. The morning after their heartfelt conversation in the library, everything felt different. Lighter. Almost. Though there was an underlying tension in the air that neither Katie nor Nathaniel could ignore. They had come to a fragile understanding, but the road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with questions neither of them had the answers to. The raw honesty they had shared was a step forward, but the shadows of the past lingered, threatening to obscure the fragile connection they were working so hard to rebuild. Katie stood by the window in her room, watching the early light spill across the garden, the dew on the grass shimmering like scattered diamonds. She felt a sense of peace, but it was tempered with the realization that something was missing, something Nathaniel had not yet shared with her. She had given him her trust, her heart, and he had done the same. But there were pieces of his past that still remained shrouded in darkness, and Katie knew in her bones that she couldn't move forward until she understood everything, until Nathaniel was ready to face the truths that had haunted him for so long. As if on cue, there was a soft knock on her door, followed by Nathaniel's voice, tentative yet warm. Katie. She turned, her heart quickening at the sound of his voice. Come in, she called, her tone gentle. The door creaked open, and Nathaniel stepped inside, his gaze immediately finding hers. He looked different today, still the man she knew, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed restless, as though something weighed heavily on him, something he couldn't escape. Katie, he began, his voice a little strained, we need to talk. Her heart sank at the seriousness in his words. She had known this moment was coming, had known that eventually, the truth would have to be revealed. But the fear of what that truth might be still gripped her tightly, even as she nodded in quiet understanding. Of course, she replied, her voice steady but her insides roiling with uncertainty. What is it? Nathaniel hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the ground before meeting her gaze once more. I told you I had things I needed to face. I didn't want to bring you into it, but I can't keep running from it, from the past. Katie's pulse quickened as she took a step closer to him, her instincts telling her that this was the moment when everything would change. Nathaniel, she said softly, her voice a comforting anchor. You don't have to carry this alone. I'm here. Always. He nodded slowly, and for a moment, he seemed to brace himself, as if preparing to divulge a secret he had kept hidden for far too long. There's something I never told you about my family. About what happened before we met, he began, his voice low and careful. Something that I've kept locked away, even from myself. Katie's heart raced, a mixture of fear and curiosity flooding her chest. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. "Nathaniel, you can tell me. Whatever it is, I promise I'll be here." He swallowed hard, a faint tremor in his hands betraying his outward calm. "It's not something I'm proud of, Katie. It's something I've tried to bury for years." Katie nodded, urging him to continue. She wanted to be the person he turned to, the person who could help him face his demons. "When I was younger," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "my family, they weren't what they seemed. My father especially. He was a man of influence, powerful in ways most people didn't understand. But there was darkness in him, things he did that he kept hidden from the world. And I was a part of that, Katie." Katie's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to process the weight of his words. She had always known that Nathaniel's family was complicated, but hearing him speak so openly about the darkness that had shaped him left her reeling. "What do you mean, Nathaniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked down at his hands, as if searching for the right words. "I was involved in things I shouldn't have been. My father's business dealings weren't just about wealth or power. There were illegal activities, corruption, and I was caught in the middle of it all." Katie's heart tightened as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone?" Nathaniel's eyes filled with regret, and he stepped away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Because I was ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know the truth. My father's legacy, the things he did, I didn't want to be tied to it. I thought if I kept my distance, if I made a life for myself away from all of it, then I could escape it. But that's not how it works. The past doesn't let you go, Katie." Katie felt a surge of compassion, but it was tangled with confusion. She could see the torment in Nathaniel's eyes, the burden of years of silence. But there was also a part of her, an instinct that told her there was more to this story, more that he hadn't yet shared. "Is that why you've been so distant?" she asked gently. "Because of your father? Because of the things you were involved in?" Nathaniel nodded, his expression darkening. "Yes, I've spent so many years running from it, trying to bury it, but it's always there, just beneath the surface. And now there are people from that past who won't let me forget. They're trying to drag me back into it, Katie, and I don't know how to protect you from it." Katie's heart ached as she stepped closer to him, her hand gently reaching out to touch his arm once more. "You don't have to protect me from everything, Nathaniel. We can face this together. Whatever it is, I'm here." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "I'm not sure if I can protect you, Katie. There are dangers, things I can't control. But I will try. I will fight for you. For us." Katie felt a shiver run down her spine at the intensity in his voice. The truth was out now, but it only raised more questions. Who were these people from Nathaniel's past? And what did they want from him? What kind of danger had he been hiding from her all this time? "I don't care about the danger, Nathaniel," Katie said softly, her voice filled with determination. "I care about you, and I'll stand by you, no matter what. We'll figure this out together. You're not alone in this." Nathaniel looked at her, his expression softening, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I don't deserve you, Katie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Katie smiled, her heart full of conviction. "You're wrong. You deserve everything, Nathaniel, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll face whatever comes next, together." As they stood there, the weight of their shared promise hanging between them, Katie realized that the path ahead was far from simple. There were dangers, there were truths yet to be uncovered, and there were scars that couldn't easily be healed. But for the first time, she felt certain of one thing. They would face it all, side by side. And together, they might just find the strength to overcome whatever darkness lay ahead. Chapter 11. A Christmas Dance Under the Stars. The air had turned cold as the days wore on, the once warm sun now obscured by thick clouds that loomed like a heavy veil over the Whitmore estate. Katie couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in her chest. The truth Nathaniel had revealed to her, though a step toward understanding, had only opened more doors, doors that seemed to lead to darkness. As she sat at the edge of the grand fireplace in the sitting room, the soft crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Nathaniel had been distant once more, retreating into himself. She could see the burden of his past weighing on him, the unspoken truths pressing down like an invisible force. And though he had promised her they would face it together, Katie couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was still being hidden. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She glanced up to see Nathaniel standing in the doorway, his posture rigid, his eyes darkened with a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. He had changed since their last conversation, his usual confidence now replaced with a wariness that unsettled her. "Can we talk?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. Katie's heart fluttered, but she forced a soft smile, motioning for him to sit beside her. "Of course. Come here." Nathaniel took a few steps into the room, his gaze never meeting hers as he sat down on the opposite side of the hearth. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, was palpable. Katie could feel the wall he had built around himself growing taller with each passing day. And though she understood the pain he was carrying, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreparably. "I've been thinking a lot," Nathaniel said after a long pause, his voice quieter than usual. "About everything. About what I told you." Katie's heart tightened. She was prepared for another confession, another piece of the puzzle to be laid bare. But the question that had been gnawing at her for days remained. Would it be enough? "I know there's more, Nathaniel. I can feel it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been holding something back. I need to understand everything. I can't be in this relationship without the full truth." Nathaniel looked up then, his eyes meeting hers with a haunted look that sent a chill down her spine. His gaze flickered briefly to the fire before he spoke again, his voice thick with regret. "You're right. There is more. But it's not easy to talk about, Katie. I don't know if I can even make you understand." Katie leaned forward, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and determination. "I need to know, Nathaniel. I need to know if this is something I can handle. If this is something we can handle. But I can't do that if you keep pulling away from me." He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. "It's not just my father's past, Katie. It's everything that came after. The people who still want a piece of me. The consequences of what I was involved in. They haven't gone away. And they never will." Katie felt the unease in her stomach deepen as his words hit her. "What do you mean by that? Who are these people, Nathaniel? What do they want from you?" Nathaniel's eyes darkened as he hesitated, as though weighing how much of the truth he could share without risking everything. "My father's enemies, they're still out there. And some of them, they think I'm the key to something. Something I can't control. They've been watching me for years, Katie. And now, they know about you." Katie's breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words hung in the air like a fog, and for the first time, she realized the true danger Nathaniel had been shielding her from. "What do they want with me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Nathaniel looked at her then, his face tight with fear and guilt. "They want leverage, Katie. They know how much you mean to me, and they'll stop at nothing to use that against me. They think if they can hurt you, they'll have control over me." Katie's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling out of control. She had always known that Nathaniel's past would catch up to him eventually, but this was something more. This was real danger, something far more insidious than she had ever imagined. "I never wanted this for you," Nathaniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to drag you into this world. But they've been watching us. Watching you. And now I'm afraid I can't protect you from it." Katie stood up abruptly, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All this time, she had thought that their struggles were merely the result of family dynamics, of secrets buried in the past. But this This was something far darker. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice shaking, "why didn't you tell me sooner? Why didn't you warn me about this?" "I tried to protect you," he said, his voice cracking as he stood up as well, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to scare you. I didn't want you to see me like this, weak, powerless. But now I realize that I've been a fool. I should have told you everything. I should have trusted you." Katie's chest tightened as she looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and betrayal. "You've been hiding this from me all this time, Nathaniel. You've kept me in the dark while you've been carrying this burden on your own. How am I supposed to trust you when you've been lying to me?" His expression faltered, and he took a step closer to her, his voice pleading. "I wasn't lying to you, Katie. I didn't want you to get hurt. You mean everything to me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." The vulnerability in his eyes, the raw honesty that he was offering, made Katie's anger falter for just a moment. She could see the pain in his eyes, the deep regret that was etched into every line of his face. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to protect her in the only way he knew how, by keeping her safe from the truth. But now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. Katie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I love you, Nathaniel. But love isn't enough to fix everything. You've kept so much from me, and now I don't know how to move forward. I need you to trust me completely, to be fully open with me. Otherwise, I don't know if we can make it." Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, the man she loved seemed so small, so broken. But even in that moment, she knew that they had come to a crossroads. They could either face the truth together, or they could let it tear them apart. "I'll do whatever it takes," he whispered. "I swear, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Katie didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The danger Nathaniel faced was far from over, and now she was a part of it. But as she looked into his eyes, she could see the sincerity in his words. She could see the man he was, flawed, yes, but willing to fight for her, for them. And in that moment, she made a choice. She would stand by him, no matter what came next. Together, they would face the storm. Chapter 12. Bound by Time, Bound by Love. The days that followed Nathaniel's confession were the hardest Katie had ever faced. The weight of his words, the knowledge of the danger that now surrounded them, hung heavily over their lives, casting a shadow that neither of them seemed able to escape. The uncertainty was suffocating. Every step they took, every glance they shared, was fraught with the tension of unspoken fears and unasked questions. Katie had always known that love wasn't easy, that relationships were not without their struggles, but she had never imagined that the man she loved would be carrying such a heavy burden, one so full of secrets, of threats, and of an unseen world so dark that it threatened to pull them both under. Still, she refused to turn away. No matter how difficult the truth was, no matter how much fear gripped her heart, she could not abandon Nathaniel. She loved him, and for better or worse, they were in this together. But as the days wore on, Katie began to realize just how little they truly knew about the full scope of the danger that loomed ahead. They were stepping into a world neither of them was prepared for, and the further they went, the more fragile their grasp on safety became. Nathaniel had been distant again, more so than before. His silences grew longer, his eyes darker, as though he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Katie could see it in the way he moved, the way he seemed to hold back from her, physically and emotionally. It was as though he was trying to keep her at arm's length, even though they had promised to face everything together. One evening, after another quiet dinner that had been consumed more with unease than conversation, Katie could no longer hold her thoughts in. She needed to break the silence, needed to bridge the gap that had slowly widened between them. "I don't understand, Nathaniel," she said, her voice barely a whisper as they sat in the drawing room, the fire crackling softly beside them. "You promised me that we'd face this together, but it feels like you're pulling away from me more every day. You're shutting me out, and I can't help you if you won't let me in." Nathaniel's shoulders tensed, his jaw clenched, and he finally met her gaze. But there was something different in his eyes, something guarded, something she hadn't seen before. "I'm not trying to shut you out, Katie," he said, his voice rough and strained. "I just don't want to drag you deeper into this mess. You don't deserve it. You don't deserve the danger that comes with my past." Katie stood up, unable to sit still any longer. She paced the room, her emotions swirling as she struggled to find the words to express how she felt. "You're wrong," she said, turning to face him. "I do deserve to know everything. I'm not going to sit on the sidelines while you fight this battle on your own. I've already chosen you, Nathaniel. That means I'm with you all the way." He stood up then, a tense energy crackling between them. "You think you know what you're signing up for, Katie, but you don't," he said, his voice breaking. "You have no idea what these people are capable of. You don't know the lengths they'll go to get what they want. And I won't let them hurt you." Katie felt her heart clench as she took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his for the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had promised her the world and more. But in this moment, he was a stranger, a man broken by his own past, a man who felt he had to protect everyone from his mistakes. "You're not protecting me by pushing me away, Nathaniel," she said softly, her words laced with the hurt she was trying so hard to suppress. "You're just making it harder for both of us. You can't keep fighting this on your own. I need you to trust me." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather himself before facing her again. When he opened them, his gaze was softer, but the vulnerability was still there, raw and undeniable. "I do trust you, Katie, more than I trust anyone. But there are things in my past that I can't change. Things I'm ashamed of. Things that I was involved in. And I can't bear the thought of you getting hurt because of it." Katie's chest tightened as she watched him, seeing the depth of his torment, the struggle within him that he had kept hidden for so long. "Nathaniel, I know your past isn't easy. I know it's filled with things that still haunt you. But I want to help you carry that burden. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." For a long moment, there was silence between them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire, the steady rhythm of their hearts pounding in unison. And then, finally, Nathaniel spoke. "There's something else," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told you. It's not just about my father and his enemies. There's someone else involved in this, someone who's been watching us from the shadows. Someone I never expected." Katie felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. "Who?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Who's been watching us?" Nathaniel hesitated, his eyes darkening with a mix of fear and anger. "My uncle, Victor Whitmore. He's been working with my father's enemies for years, manipulating things from behind the scenes. He's the one who's been pulling the strings, who's been orchestrating everything. And now he's coming for me." Katie's blood ran cold. She had suspected that there were people in Nathaniel's life who weren't what they seemed. But this was a whole new level of betrayal. His uncle, someone Nathaniel had trusted, someone who should have been family, had been plotting against him all along. And now, with everything at stake, it was clear that the danger was closer than they had ever imagined. "Victor," Katie whispered, her mind racing with the implications of what Nathaniel had just said. "He's been involved in all of this? He's the one who wants to take you down." Nathaniel nodded grimly. "Yes, he's been manipulating everything, using my family's legacy for his own gain. And now that he knows about you, Katie, he won't stop until he has control over both of us. He'll use whatever he can to make me bow to him, and I'm afraid he'll stop at nothing." Katie's heart pounded in her chest as the gravity of the situation hit her all at once. The man she loved, the man she had promised to stand by, was being hunted, not just by enemies from his father's past, but by his own blood. She couldn't help but feel a surge of anger, of betrayal, for what Nathaniel had been forced to endure. But in the face of it all, she knew that they couldn't give up. "Not now. We'll fight him, Nathaniel," Katie said, her voice filled with conviction. "We'll fight Victor. Together." Nathaniel looked at her, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his eyes. "You don't understand, Katie. This isn't just about us. It's bigger than that. It's a battle for power, for control of everything my father built. And Victor won't stop until he has it all." Katie stepped closer to him, her eyes fierce. "I don't care how big it is, Nathaniel. We've already lost too much. I won't let him take you from me. We will fight. We will take back what's ours." For a moment, Nathaniel said nothing, his expression unreadable. But then, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, a smile that spoke volumes, a smile that said, "I'm not alone anymore." And in that moment, Katie knew that no matter how dark the world seemed, no matter how impossible the battle ahead might be, they would face it together. And together, they might just be able to conquer whatever came next. Chapter 13. The Truth of the Celestial Pine. The days that followed their conversation were a blur of urgency and tension. It was as though the world had shifted around Katie and Nathaniel, leaving them standing on the precipice of something monumental. Victor Whitmore's betrayal loomed over them like a dark cloud, but they refused to let fear control their every move. They knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick, but they were determined, as uncertain as the path ahead seemed, to stand their ground. For now, they had a fragile peace, a temporary lull before the storm. Nathaniel had made arrangements to gather what resources he could, reaching out to a few old allies who had been loyal to his father, trying to shore up what little trust they could still rely on. Katie, ever resolute, had taken on the task of organizing their defenses, finding ways to stay one step ahead of Victor and his machinations. But despite their best efforts, Katie couldn't shake the sense of impending danger. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every shadow that crossed their path felt like it could be the moment things would change. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she refused to let it show. Nathaniel, too, wore the weight of the world on his shoulders, though he was careful not to show it. The days were long, filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and calls that made his mind swirl with worries about what might come next. But through it all, he tried to remain present for Katie, to reassure her with small gestures, fleeting moments of closeness when they could steal them. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with one of Nathaniel's old confidants, they found themselves alone in the sitting room again. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth offering a false sense of comfort against the coldness that seemed to seep into their bones. Katie sat on the couch, her mind racing with the thoughts of what they had to do next. Nathaniel had just returned, looking more exhausted than usual, his eyes darkened by sleepless nights. "Katie," he said softly as he entered the room, his voice carrying the weight of a dozen unspoken fears. "We need to talk." Katie's heart skipped a beat. His tone, low and heavy, carried an edge of finality that made her stomach twist. She knew that whatever he was about to say wasn't something she would be able to ignore. She set aside the papers in her lap and looked up at him, bracing herself for whatever came next. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel began, his eyes not meeting hers as he took a seat across from her. "We've been preparing for what's to come, but I don't think we're ready. We can't keep living like this, constantly looking over our shoulders, never knowing when the next attack might come." Katie felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what he was saying, and part of her had been dreading it. "What are you suggesting?" Nathaniel met her gaze then, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that this moment, this choice, wasn't easy for either of them. "I'm suggesting that we leave. We go somewhere far away, away from all of this. Somewhere safe. I can't risk losing you, Katie." Her breath caught in her throat. The idea had crossed her mind, but she hadn't dared to voice it. Leaving, running from the fight, it was a tempting notion, one that would offer a sense of peace, a reprieve from the constant pressure of their situation. But it didn't feel right. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "I'm not running, Nathaniel," Katie said, her voice firm. "I'm not leaving. We've come too far. We've made a promise to each other. You can't just walk away from this now." Nathaniel sighed, his hand running through his hair in frustration. "I don't want to lose you. I can't stand the thought of something happening to you because of me. You've already risked so much by being with me, but I can't ask you to stay in this chaos." Katie stood up then, her resolve hardening like iron. "I'm staying with you, Nathaniel. You're not going through this alone. I don't care what happens. I'm in this with you. We'll face it together, just like we promised." Nathaniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the same battle he'd been fighting internally ever since they'd learned the truth about his uncle. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the dangers that were now closing in on them. But in that moment, Katie understood something that Nathaniel couldn't yet see. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't let fear dictate their lives any longer. "I love you, Katie," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "And I would do anything to protect you." Katie stepped closer to him, her heart swelling with love and determination. "And I love you, Nathaniel. And I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together. That's the promise we made." For a long moment, there was silence between them. But this time, it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of unspoken fears. It was the quiet of shared understanding, of two hearts beating in unison. Nathaniel reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he took it in his own. "Then we'll fight. Together." Katie nodded, a fierce light in her eyes. Together. The weight of the world still loomed over them, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Katie felt a flicker of hope. They would face whatever came next, not as two people burdened by the past, but as two people standing side by side, ready to fight for their future. As they stood there in the quiet room, the fire flickering softly in the background, they both knew that the road ahead would be treacherous. They would face betrayal, danger, and forces beyond their control. But they had each other, and that was more than enough to give them the strength to keep moving forward. But even as they found a moment of peace, Katie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the calm before the storm. The final battle was coming, and when it came, nothing, no matter how strong their love, could stop the forces that were gathering against them. For now, though, they had each other, and that, at least, was a start. Chapter 14, Snowfall of Memories. The days that followed their conversation were a quiet sort of madness. The calm they had fought so hard to maintain was fleeting, and soon the unease crept back into their lives, slipping in through cracks they hadn't known existed. Nathaniel's decision to stand and fight had been made, but the burden of that choice weighed on him more than he was willing to admit. Katie, too, felt it, an unspoken tension that filled the spaces between them, even when they stood side by side. Nathaniel's plan was taking shape, though not as quickly as either of them had hoped. They couldn't afford to move recklessly. Every decision had to be precise, calculated. They had to be smart about this if they were to have any hope of standing against the forces closing in on them. But the longer they waited, the more Nathaniel's past seemed to catch up with him. His uncle's influence was spreading, and Victor Whitmore had never been one to be patient when it came to achieving his goals. It was late one evening when the message came. Katie had been sitting at the desk, organizing documents for Nathaniel's meeting the next day, when the knock on the door came. The sound echoed through the house like a distant drumbeat, and before she could respond, Nathaniel was already there, his face drawn tight with an intensity she couldn't place. "What is it?" Katie asked, pushing herself up from the chair. Nathaniel's expression was grim, his eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite read. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "We've got trouble," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Katie's heart skipped a beat. She could feel it then, the weight of something coming, something they weren't ready for. "What happened?" "I just received word. There's been a breach. Someone on the inside, someone we thought we could trust, has turned on us." His voice shook with the kind of fury that only betrayal could ignite. "Victor's people have infiltrated our ranks. They know what we're planning." Katie's blood ran cold. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what Nathaniel was saying. "How much do they know?" "Enough," he replied curtly. "Enough to know that we're making our move. The question is, how much longer do we have before they make theirs?" Katie took a step back, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do we do?" Nathaniel met her gaze, his jaw clenched. "We fight. We fight now. There's no time to waste." Katie swallowed hard, the enormity of the situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. This was it. The storm they had been preparing for was finally here, and there was no turning back. "I'm with you," she said, her voice unwavering. "You know that." Nathaniel gave a sharp nod, his expression hardening. He didn't say anything, but his gaze softened slightly, a fleeting moment of gratitude shining through the storm of emotions swirling inside him. They moved quickly, gathering what they needed, preparing to take action before Victor and his men could make a move of their own. Katie found herself working alongside Nathaniel as they put everything into motion. There was no room for hesitation now, only the sharp clarity of purpose that surged between them. Hours passed in a blur of activity, but even as they worked, Katie couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Her instincts, honed over years of fighting for survival in her own way, told her that things weren't as they seemed. There was something bigger at play here, something they hadn't yet understood. But she couldn't afford to focus on doubts. Not now. As the night wore on, the time came to make their move. Nathaniel called upon a few trusted allies to help them execute the plan. People who had stuck by him through thick and thin. But even as they prepared to leave, a strange sense of foreboding clung to Katie's chest. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet. The darkness seemed deeper tonight, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Nathaniel turned to her as they reached the car, his expression unreadable. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We can't afford any mistakes." Katie nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily in her chest. "I will." The drive to their destination felt like an eternity, the city lights blurring past them as they sped through the streets. Each mile seemed to bring them closer to something they couldn't avoid. Nathaniel's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with the strain. The minutes dragged on, until at last they reached an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was abandoned, its windows boarded up, the remnants of a once thriving business now left to decay. Katie could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as they pulled to a stop, the sense of danger thick in the air. Nathaniel turned off the engine, the silence in the car oppressive. He looked over at Katie, his gaze softening for a moment before hardening again with determination. "We're going in. No turning back." Katie took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'm ready." They exited the car and moved toward the warehouse, their footsteps muted on the cracked pavement. Nathaniel held up a hand, signaling for Katie to stop as they approached the door. He listened for a moment, his eyes scanning the dark surroundings. Then, with a decisive motion, he pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The interior was cold and empty, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the vast space. But Katie's instincts were screaming at her. Something was wrong. The air felt charged, thick with tension. The familiar feeling of danger lingered in her chest, a constant hum in the back of her mind. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Katie's unease grew. She felt the weight of the moment, the sense that everything was leading to this confrontation, this inevitable clash between them and the forces that had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. And then, as they reached the center of the room, the lights flickered on, blinding them for a moment. When their eyes adjusted, they saw them, Victor's men, waiting for them in the shadows, their faces unreadable, their weapons ready. Katie's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground beside Nathaniel, her hand instinctively reaching for his. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Victor Whitmore had finally made his move, and they were ready to face him, together. Chapter 15, Fighting Fate. The moment the lights flickered on, Katie's senses heightened. The cold, metallic scent of danger filled the air, seeping into her lungs with every breath. Nathaniel was beside her, his body tense, eyes scanning the shadows as they revealed the silhouettes of Victor Whitmore's men. The warehouse had become a cage, and they were trapped inside it, but Katie refused to feel fear. Not now. Not when she had come this far. Victor's voice echoed in the vast space, rich and menacing. Well, Nathaniel, did you think you could hide forever? He stepped forward, the shadows falling around him like a cloak, his features barely visible in the half-light. You and your little soldier here. How quaint. Katie's heart raced, but she stood her ground, keeping her hand firmly clasped around Nathaniel's. She could feel his pulse, steady but strained, beneath his skin. He was ready for this, but she knew that his anger simmered just below the surface. Victor had taken so much from him already, and now, there was nothing left but to take it all back. Nathaniel's voice rang out, cutting through the silence like a blade. This ends tonight, Uncle. You've had your time. But no more. No more of this. Victor's laughter echoed off the walls, cruel and mocking. You still think you can defeat me? You still think you have the strength to win this fight? His eyes gleamed, a dangerous glint of madness dancing behind them. You're nothing, Nathaniel. You always were. Just like your father. Katie could feel Nathaniel stiffen beside her. The mention of his father was a wound that never fully healed, a scar that had been carved into his soul long ago. But he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. I'm not my father, Nathaniel said, his voice low but firm. And you'll learn that tonight. Before Katie could react, Victor's men lunged forward. It all happened so quickly, the sudden burst of motion catching them off guard. But Nathaniel was already moving, his hand pulling Katie into a protective embrace, his body shielding hers as the first wave of attackers came at them. Katie's breath quickened, her mind racing. She didn't hesitate. The training that had been ingrained in her since childhood kicked in. She spun, using the momentum of her body to slam an elbow into one of the attacker's gut, sending him stumbling back. Her instincts took over, her movements fluid and precise as she grabbed a metal pipe from the ground, swinging it at the next man who tried to grab her. Beside her, Nathaniel was a force of nature. He fought with a cold, calculated precision, his punches landing with brutal accuracy. His movements were fluid, his body a weapon as he took down one opponent after another. But there was something more behind his eyes, a fury that burned so intensely. Katie could feel the heat of it even from where she stood. This wasn't just about survival for him. It was personal. She caught a glimpse of his face as he fought, a flash of pain, of grief, and of something else she couldn't quite place. This wasn't the Nathaniel she had known, the one who had been so composed, so in control. This was a man who had reached his breaking point, and Victor was about to feel every ounce of that rage. Katie's gaze flickered toward Victor, who watched from the sidelines. His eyes narrowed with dark amusement. He wasn't lifting a finger to fight. Instead, he was content to watch his men do the dirty work, as though he were a king sitting upon his throne, watching the battle unfold beneath him. He had never been one to soil his hands with the mess he created, but it was clear to Katie that his time was running out. His men were faltering, and his control over the situation was slipping. Katie felt a surge of determination. They couldn't let this go on any longer. They had to end it now. With a swift motion, she threw the pipe to the ground and ran toward Nathaniel, who had just taken down the last of the men in front of him. He didn't see her coming, too focused on the fight. But Katie didn't need him to. She knew exactly what they had to do. Now, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a sharp wind. Nathaniel's eyes met hers in a flash of recognition, and in that moment, they both knew what had to happen next. They moved as one, synchronizing their steps as they advanced toward Victor. Katie's heart hammered in her chest, but her resolve was ironclad. This was the moment, the one that would determine everything. Victor's eyes widened, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected them to push past his men with such ferocity. But he recovered quickly, his hand going to his side, where he had hidden a gun, the cold steel gleaming in the dim light. "Do you think you can defeat me?" Victor hissed, raising the gun toward them. "I don't care about your little games, Nathaniel. This ends when I say it ends." But Nathaniel was already moving, a blur of motion as he lunged forward, disarming Victor with a swift strike to the wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and in the same movement, Nathaniel had Victor pinned to the floor, his knee pressing into his uncle's chest as he held him down with brutal force. Katie stood over them, her breathing heavy, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of what they were doing, the finality of it all. But there was no other choice. Victor gasped for breath beneath Nathaniel, his eyes wild with panic. "You'll regret this, Nathaniel. You think you've won, but you haven't. You'll never be free of me. Never." Nathaniel's grip tightened, his gaze unwavering. "You're finished. This is over." Katie watched, a strange sense of satisfaction washing over her as Victor's once imposing figure crumpled beneath Nathaniel's strength. It wasn't over yet, not truly. They still had to deal with the aftermath, with the fallout from this confrontation. But in that moment, as the man who had been the source of all their pain lay defeated before them, Katie felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. The storm had passed, but it had come at a cost. Nathaniel stood slowly, his chest heaving as he looked down at Victor, who was now rendered powerless. There was no triumph in his eyes, no victory to celebrate. Only the quiet knowledge that they had done what they had to do. Katie stepped closer, her voice soft. "It's done." Nathaniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's done." But as they stood there, in the wreckage of everything they had fought for, Katie couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Or had they simply opened the door to a new chapter, one that would be even darker than the last? Chapter 16, The Last Winter Night. The warehouse, once filled with the sound of clashing forces, had fallen eerily quiet. Nathaniel stood motionless, his body still pulsing with the adrenaline of the battle they had just fought. His breath was slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Victor, who lay defeated at his feet. Yet, there was no feeling of triumph in Nathaniel's chest, no rush of victory that usually came with a hard-won battle. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness, a silence that pressed heavily against his thoughts. Kitty could feel it too. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though everything they had fought for, every sacrifice, had led them to this moment. A moment where victory tasted bitter rather than sweet. She stepped toward Nathaniel, her footsteps muffled against the cold concrete floor. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but firm. "Nathaniel, is it really over? Or is this just the beginning?" Nathaniel didn't respond right away. He looked down at Victor once more, the weight of his uncle's betrayal heavy in his gaze. The man who had once been a mentor, a father figure, was now nothing more than a broken shell of the person Nathaniel had hoped to defeat. Victor's eyes flickered open for a brief moment. His lips curled into a spiteful sneer. "You think you've won, boy? You'll never be free. You'll always carry the chains of my influence with you. I've made sure of that. You can't outrun the past." Nathaniel's hand curled into a fist, his knuckles white with tension. But before he could say anything, Katie moved closer, her voice cutting through the darkness between them. "Enough," she said, her tone steady but resolute. "It's over. You've lost." Victor's mocking expression faded, his breathing labored and shallow as the realization settled in. The fight was over, and Nathaniel had triumphed. The chains he had spoken of were no more. Katie reached out, gently placing her hand on Nathaniel's arm. "We can't change what's been done, Nathaniel, but we can choose how we move forward." Her words seemed to draw him back from the edge. Nathaniel's tense shoulders relaxed slightly, though the weight of the battle lingered. He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before his gaze softened, the walls he had built around himself cracking just enough to let the exhaustion and pain slip through. "You're right," he said, his voice hoarse. "But that doesn't make the path forward any clearer." Katie nodded, her eyes searching his face for the comfort that had once come so easily between them. She understood the toll this had taken on him. The burden of carrying so much, of carrying not only his family's legacy but also the weight of their shared fight, had worn him down. But even in the midst of the chaos, she knew that this man before her was stronger than he realized. "We take it one step at a time," she said softly. "Together." Nathaniel's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Together," he repeated, the word a promise between them. Victor's laughter, though weak, filled the room again, reminding them that the battle, though over, was not without consequence. "You think this is the end? You have no idea what you've unleashed. The people I've worked with, the ones who helped me get this far, they won't stop. Not until you're both gone." Katie felt a shiver run down her spine at the venom in Victor's voice, but she refused to let him see any sign of fear. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," she said, her voice firm. "You've lost, Victor, and you'll pay for everything you've done." Victor's eyes flickered with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was fear, or maybe just pure anger. Whatever it was, it didn't matter now. Nathaniel had already claimed his victory. And no matter how many shadows Victor tried to summon, Nathaniel and Katie would face them together. Nathaniel's eyes lingered on his uncle for a moment longer, the weight of his decision settling deeper into his bones. He took a deep breath, pushing aside the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. It wasn't over, but they had won. The first battle, at least. "We need to go," Nathaniel said, his voice low but steady. Katie nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest as they turned to leave. As they walked toward the exit, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming. Something darker. Victor's words had been a warning, but there was a part of her that wondered if there was more to it than just empty threats. The world outside was cold and still, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. It was a strange kind of silence, one that filled her ears and left her with an unsettling sense of isolation. The city, once full of life and noise, seemed distant and indifferent as they stepped into the shadows of the night. Nathaniel opened the door of the car, but before he could get in, Katie's hand reached out, stopping him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. Nathaniel turned to her, his brows furrowed. "About what?" Katie hesitated, searching for the right words. She could feel the weight of everything they had just endured, but there was something else in her heart, a nagging feeling that she couldn't ignore. "What's next for us, Nathaniel? We've come so far, but what happens when the dust settles? When everything is over?" Nathaniel's expression softened, and he gave a small nod, understanding the unspoken fear in her voice. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out. One step at a time. Together." Katie nodded, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. There was no clear path ahead of them, no easy answer to the questions that lingered in the air between them. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. They had survived the storm. They had overcome the darkness. And as long as they had each other, maybe they could face whatever came next. Nathaniel opened the door of the car for her, and as she climbed in, she felt his hand settle on hers for a brief moment, steadying her. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, words they didn't need to say. As they drove into the night, Katie couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold. What challenges, what trials lay ahead. But for now, she had Nathaniel by her side, and that, in itself, was enough. Chapter 17. When the clock strikes 12. The air had grown colder as the days passed since their confrontation with Victor Whitmore. The city outside their window seemed to sleep under a blanket of clouds, its streets empty, the familiar hum of life subdued in the wake of their battle. Yet, inside the small apartment Nathaniel had chosen as their refuge, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Katie sat by the window, her gaze distant as she stared out at the gray skyline. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the rim of her coffee cup, but she didn't taste the warmth of it. Instead, her thoughts were consumed by the consequences of everything they had done and what would come next. The silence between her and Nathaniel was palpable, but it wasn't the kind of silence that spoke of peace. It was the silence of two people trapped in their own thoughts, unable to fully grasp the weight of their decisions. Nathaniel, for his part, had barely spoken since the night they'd left the warehouse. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his jaw tight with tension as he tried to process everything that had transpired. The weight of his uncle's betrayal had taken its toll on him, leaving him restless, as if a storm still raged inside of him, waiting for release. Katie could see it in the way he moved, the way his eyes darted to every corner of the room, as if he were expecting something or someone to appear from the shadows. She understood. Victor's parting words had planted a seed of doubt in them both. They had won the battle, but what of the war? Victor's connections, his promises to those who stood behind him, lingered like a specter. Was it truly over, or had they just ignited a fire that would burn out of control? She turned her gaze back to Nathaniel, his figure standing by the door, his posture tense. He had yet to speak a word to her this morning, and she wondered, with a sinking feeling, whether he even knew how to begin. "Are you all right?" she finally asked, her voice soft but firm enough to draw his attention. Nathaniel glanced at her briefly, his lips twitching into a fleeting smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't all right, not by a long shot, but he wasn't ready to admit it. "Not yet. I'm fine," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Katie didn't believe him. She never did. She knew him better than that. The man who had stood so resolutely in the face of danger, the man who had fought tooth and nail to protect the ones he loved, was now a shadow of himself. The battle had taken more from him than she had realized. She stood up slowly, closing the distance between them with measured steps. "You don't have to pretend, Nathaniel," she said, her voice gentle but insistent. "We've both been through so much, and I'm not going anywhere. But we have to face this together." Nathaniel's eyes met hers, the hardness in them slowly fading as he exhaled a long, shaky breath. For the first time in days, his shoulders seemed to relax, the weight of the world lifting, if only for a moment. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out to find hers. "I don't know how to do this, Katie," he admitted, his voice raw, vulnerable in a way she hadn't heard before. "I don't know how to move forward from all of this. My uncle, I thought I could handle it. I thought that if I just faced him, it would all make sense. But now, I don't know if anything will ever make sense again." Katie squeezed his hand, her heart aching for him. She had seen the darkness he carried, had watched him struggle under the weight of it. But she knew him better than anyone. She knew that even in the face of this uncertainty, Nathaniel Whitmore was not one to give up. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said softly, guiding him to sit down beside her. "We don't have to figure everything out today. We take it one step at a time." Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. He had always been the strong one, the protector, the one who carried the burden of everything on his shoulders. But in that moment, he allowed himself to lean on her, just for a while. "I don't want to drag you into this mess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done so much for me already. I don't know how to repay you for all of this." Katie's response was simple but profound. "You don't need to repay me, Nathaniel. I'm here because I want to be. You're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." His gaze softened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a genuine smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that despite everything, he hadn't lost himself completely. The room fell into a peaceful silence, the kind that only came when two people, bound by something deeper than words, found solace in each other's presence. It was in these moments, these small, fleeting moments of quiet, that they could breathe again, could forget the chaos that swirled just outside their door. But as they sat there, holding on to one another, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Katie's heart skipped a beat, her hand instinctively tightening around Nathaniel's. His expression hardened, the mask of composure slipping back into place as he stood, moving toward the door without a word. She followed close behind, her mind racing with possibilities. Who could it be? When Nathaniel opened the door, he found a familiar face standing on the other side. It was James, one of Nathaniel's trusted allies, his eyes wary but determined. "Is everything all right?" James asked, his gaze flickering between Nathaniel and Katie, sensing the tension in the air. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for James to come inside. As the door clicked shut behind him, Nathaniel's voice was low but urgent. "What's going on? What brings you here?" James hesitated for a moment before speaking, his expression grave. "We've got trouble, Nathaniel. Victor, he's not the only one pulling strings. There's more to this than we thought. People in your uncle's circle, they're making moves. And they won't stop until they've finished what he started." Katie felt her stomach drop, the unease from before rising like a wave. She exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, who seemed to have regained some of his focus, the fight in his eyes reigniting. "I knew it wasn't over," Nathaniel muttered, the edge of steel creeping back into his voice. "What do we do now?" James glanced around the room before answering, his tone grim. "We prepare. It's going to get worse before it gets better, but we can't back down now." Katie knew that the fight they had won was only the beginning. They were stepping into something much larger, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. But as she looked at Nathaniel, his jaw set with determination, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The promise they had made to each other, of facing the darkness side by side, would be their guiding light through whatever lay ahead. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 18, The Vanishing Promise. The weight of James's words hung heavily in the air, settling over the room like a storm cloud threatening to break. Katie could see the tension in Nathaniel's posture, the way his jaw clenched as he processed the information. They had fought Victor Whitmore, defeated him, and yet, it felt as if the real battle was just beginning. James stood before them, his expression grave, his voice low as he outlined the grim reality of the situation. "There are powerful people behind your uncle, Nathaniel. People you don't even know about. His connections run deeper than you could have ever imagined." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. "I knew he had influence, but I didn't realize how far it reached." James nodded, his brow furrowing. "There's a network of loyalists, men and women who've been working in the shadows. They've been waiting for the right moment to act, and now that your uncle is out of the picture, they'll make their move. They won't rest until they've taken control, and they'll stop at nothing to see that through." Katie could feel the weight of his words sinking into her chest, suffocating her with a cold sense of dread. This wasn't just about Nathaniel's uncle anymore. This was about something much larger, something that threatened not only their lives, but everything they had fought for. "We need to move fast," Nathaniel said, his voice cold with determination. "Where do we start?" James hesitated, his gaze flickering between them. "We need to gather information. Find out who's pulling the strings now. We can't afford to go in blind." Katie felt a chill run down her spine. They had been in danger before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now. The enemy wasn't just one man. They were a network of shadowy figures, faceless and powerful, lurking in the background, waiting to strike. Nathaniel met her gaze, his eyes filled with the same resolve she had seen in him before. "We'll do whatever it takes. We can't let them win." Katie nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what they were about to face. She knew Nathaniel wasn't just talking about the fight ahead. He was talking about their future, about everything they had worked for, But the road ahead was uncertain, and the danger they were about to face would test them in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. The days that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. The tension in the apartment was palpable as Nathaniel and James worked tirelessly to gather information, piecing together the puzzle that Victor had left behind. Every lead they followed seemed to open up more questions than answers. It was as though the entire network of Victor's allies had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace, no sign of where they might be hiding. Katie, ever the pragmatist, spent her days combing through old records, searching for anything that might give them an edge. She knew they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The enemy they were facing was too powerful, too elusive. And every moment they spent searching was one more moment they were vulnerable. One evening, as the sun set and the city lights flickered to life outside their window, James returned to the apartment with news that made Katie's blood run cold. "I've got something," he said, his voice tense. He handed Nathaniel a folder, his fingers tracing the edges nervously. "This came from one of my contacts. It's a lead on one of Victor's associates, a man named Roland Drake." Nathaniel flipped through the papers quickly, his eyes scanning the information with the practiced speed of someone who had spent years in the business of uncovering secrets. "Drake. I've heard that name before," he muttered. "He was one of the financial backers for my uncle's operations. But I thought he was clean. Too clean." James nodded grimly. "That's what makes him dangerous. He's the kind of man who blends in, keeps a low profile, but he's got deep connections. I've been digging, and it looks like he's been laundering money through a series of shell companies. And there's more. He's been in contact with some very powerful people." Katie frowned, her mind racing. But if Drake's been helping Victor, why wouldn't he have made a move sooner? Why wait until now? James's eyes darkened as he answered. "Because they've been waiting for the right moment, just like I said. They've been playing a long game. And now, with your uncle gone, they've decided it's time to make their move." Nathaniel's face hardened, his jaw clenching in anger. "Then we go after him. We find Drake, we take him down, and we use him to find the others." Katie could feel the tension rising in the room, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew this was the next step. They couldn't let this man slip through their fingers, couldn't afford to let him vanish into the shadows. But there was something unsettling in the way Nathaniel spoke. It was as if he had already made up his mind to do whatever it took to get the information they needed, no matter the cost. She met his gaze, her heart heavy with concern. "Nathaniel, we have to be careful. We can't just charge in without a plan." He looked at her then, and for the briefest moment, she saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a steely resolve. "I know, but we can't wait. Not anymore. We have to act before they do." Katie sighed, rubbing her temples as the weight of their situation pressed down on her. This wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. This was about stopping a network of powerful, unseen enemies who had been manipulating the world from the shadows. And Nathaniel, for all his strength and determination, was stepping into a battle that could destroy everything they had fought to protect. "We'll do it together," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. "We'll find Drake, and we'll bring him down." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no turning back now. The fight had only just begun. Later that night, as they prepared for the mission ahead, Katie found herself standing by the window once again, looking out at the city. The lights below twinkled like distant stars, beautiful and out of reach. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something bigger, something that could change everything. Nathaniel joined her, his presence a steady anchor beside her. He reached out, taking her hand in his fingers warm against the cool night air. "We'll make it through this," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "We've come this far, and we'll keep going." Katie looked at him, seeing the man who had fought so hard to protect her, to protect them both. And in that moment, despite the uncertainty and the danger that lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. They would face it together. The future was unknown, the road ahead perilous. But as long as they had each other, they would keep fighting. For their promise, for their love, and for the world they were determined to protect. Chapter 19. A Constellation of Love. The days that followed the discovery of Roland Drake's involvement felt like a delicate balance between anticipation and dread. Nathaniel, Katie, and James had retreated into the shadows, laying the groundwork for their next move. It was a strange kind of peace that settled over the apartment, an illusion of safety that masked the inevitable storm looming on the horizon. Katie found herself waking up in the quiet hours of the morning before the world outside had fully come to life. The soft glow of the streetlights filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. She lay there for a moment, just listening to the distant hum of the city, before rising and making her way to the kitchen. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, a constant buzz that refused to settle. They had uncovered the first piece of the puzzle, but there was still so much they didn't know. Who else was involved in this vast network of shadowy figures? And what were they truly after? The silence of the apartment was comforting, but also unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was always just beyond the corner, waiting for the right moment to strike. Nathaniel had been quiet lately, his focus entirely on the task at hand. She hadn't seen him this determined in weeks. His mind was consumed by the mission, by the need to find Drake and uncover the full extent of his involvement in his uncle's empire. It was hard to ignore the way his eyes had hardened when he spoke of their next steps. He was ready for whatever came next, but she could sense the toll it was taking on him. The weight of it all was heavy, and it was clear that he was carrying more than just his own burden. Katie stirred her coffee slowly, letting the warmth of the mug seep into her hands. She knew that Nathaniel wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for himself, for everything that had been stolen from him. And perhaps, more than anything, he was fighting for the future he had once dreamed of, the one where he and Katie could have peace, free from the shadows of his family's legacy. She glanced up as Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. There was a slight shift in the air when he entered the room, a tension that hung between them like an unspoken conversation. "Good morning," she said softly, offering him a small smile. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "Morning," he replied, his voice low and steady. He paused, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "James is setting up the meeting with Drake's contact. We're going to find him today." Katie's heart skipped a beat. The day had arrived sooner than she had anticipated. It had been the plan all along, but the reality of it felt different when it was finally here. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Nathaniel's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, she saw the man she had come to love, the one who had been through so much, yet still had the strength to push forward. He crossed the room, his steps deliberate, and sat beside her at the kitchen table. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet determination. "We've been circling this for too long. It's time to finish it." Katie felt a flicker of doubt, but she didn't voice it. She knew that Nathaniel needed to do this, needed to face what had been haunting him for so long. And yet, a small part of her couldn't shake the fear that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they realized. She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining as if the simple touch could anchor them both in the storm that was about to break. "We'll face it together," she said quietly, her gaze meeting his with the kind of certainty that only came from years of shared experiences. Nathaniel squeezed her hand in return, his eyes searching hers. Together. The drive to the meeting point was tense, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. James, as usual, was in the driver's seat, his eyes focused on the road ahead, while Nathaniel and Katie sat in the back. The cityscape passed by in a blur of motion, the familiar sights of their world now tinged with an unfamiliar sense of foreboding. As they neared the location, Nathaniel's grip on Katie's hand tightened. "This is it," he murmured. Katie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They were close now, so close to the truth. And yet, the closer they got, the more she felt the shadows creeping in. There was something about the way the city felt today, as though everything was just a little bit off, as if the walls were closing in on them. The car came to a stop in front of a nondescript building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was an unremarkable place. No signs, no indication of what lay behind its doors. Just another empty shell in a city full of secrets. James turned off the engine, glancing over his shoulder at Nathaniel and Katie. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Nathaniel's gaze never wavered from the building ahead. "Let's do it." Katie felt a shiver run down her spine, but she squared her shoulders, determined to stay focused. She had to be strong for Nathaniel, for both of them. She wasn't going to let fear dictate their fate. Together, they exited the car, the cool air biting at their skin as they made their way toward the entrance. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of everything that had led them here was pressing down on them all at once. Nathaniel led the way, his movements purposeful, while Katie followed closely behind, her eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. They reached the door, and Nathaniel knocked twice, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the stillness. There was a long pause before the door opened, revealing a man whose face Katie didn't recognize. He was tall, with a sharp, calculating gaze that seemed to see right through them. "Come in," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, Katie at his side, and they entered the building, the door closing softly behind them. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and tobacco. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but there was a sense of emptiness in the space, as though it had been designed to give no clues, to reveal nothing. The man gestured for them to sit. "Drake will be here shortly," he said, his tone matter of fact. "You've come to the right place." Katie sat down, her eyes never leaving the man. Something about him felt off, too calm, too composed, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. As they waited, Katie's thoughts raced. Roland Drake was close, so close. And yet, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. Chapter 20. Whispers in the Night Sky. The silence in the room felt suffocating. The air was thick with anticipation, each passing moment stretching into an eternity. Katie's heart beat in her chest like a drum, the rhythmic pulse echoing in her ears. She sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the man who had ushered them in, her instincts screaming that they were not alone. Nathaniel sat beside her, his face unreadable, yet the tension in his posture told her everything she needed to know. He was ready, ready for the answers, ready for whatever came next, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of his past. And Katie, though terrified, was prepared to stand beside him, just as she always had. The minutes dragged by like hours. The man who had opened the door remained standing by the far wall, his eyes darting between them, an enigmatic smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't speak, but his presence alone was enough to make the air hum with unspoken words. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of someone who had all the time in the world. And then, just as Katie's breath hitched, the door swung open. Roland Drake entered the room with an air of quiet confidence. His presence was commanding, and the tension in the air doubled the moment he stepped across the threshold. He was exactly as Katie had imagined him. Tall, with sharp features that seemed carved from stone, and eyes that gleamed with a cold, calculating intelligence. His gaze swept over Nathaniel and Katie, lingering for a fraction longer on her, before settling on Nathaniel. A faint smile curled at the corner of his lips. "You must be Nathaniel Whitmore," Roland said, his voice smooth as velvet but laced with something darker. "I've heard quite a lot about you." Nathaniel didn't flinch, his eyes steady as he met Roland's gaze. "I'm sure you have," he replied, his voice cold, as if they were strangers discussing mundane matters. But Katie could sense the weight of history between them, the kind of history that could never be erased with simple words. Roland chuckled softly, as if enjoying the silence. "This must be your companion, Katie, isn't it? I imagine you've been a great source of strength for Nathaniel." Katie stiffened but didn't respond. The last thing she would do was give Roland the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "You know why we're here," Nathaniel said, his voice hard. "I'm done playing games, Drake. We know what you're involved in. We know what you've been hiding." Drake's eyes flickered with a brief spark of something, a hint of surprise, perhaps, or something more sinister. "So, you figured it out. Clever boy." His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "But you're still missing the bigger picture." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Katie could feel the shift in the room, the dangerous undercurrent of Roland's words hanging in the air. It was as though he were savoring the moment, enjoying the final act of the game. "You've been chasing shadows," Roland continued, his voice almost teasing. "Everything you've uncovered, every step you've taken, it's all been orchestrated. You've been dancing on the strings, Nathaniel, and I've been pulling them." Katie's pulse quickened. She exchanged a glance with Nathaniel, who was still composed, but she could see the subtle tightening of his shoulders, the way his muscles tensed. He had always known his family's legacy was a web of lies and secrets, but this was beyond what he had ever imagined. "What are you talking about?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Who else is involved? What do you want from me?" Roland's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "Your uncle, of course," he said simply. "Did you think he was just a bystander in all this?" "No, Nathaniel. He's the mastermind, the puppet master. And you, well, you're just the heir to a throne that's been built on corruption, lies, and blood." Katie's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of Roland's words settling over her, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. It was not just Roland who was pulling the strings, it was Nathaniel's uncle, the man who had claimed to be the protector, the guardian. The very man who had betrayed Nathaniel's trust. "Why are you telling me this?" Nathaniel's voice was low now, controlled, but Katie could feel the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She could see the cracks starting to form. The truth was hitting him harder than she'd imagined. Roland leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of amusement and malice. "Because, my dear boy, you need to understand the truth before it's too late. Your uncle has plans for you. Plans that involve more than just taking over a company. You've been groomed for this moment your whole life, and you never even realized it." Katie's mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what Roland was saying. Nathaniel's uncle was not just a passive figure in the background. He was the orchestrator, the architect of a much larger scheme, one that had been in motion long before Nathaniel had even understood what was at stake. Nathaniel's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "I won't be a part of whatever twisted plan he's devised. I won't let you manipulate me any longer." Roland's smile widened, and for a moment, there was something almost predatory in his gaze. "That's where you're wrong, Nathaniel. You've already played your part. You just don't realize it yet." Before either of them could react, the man who had led them into the room stepped forward, pulling a small, polished box from inside his coat. He placed it on the table in front of Nathaniel. It was simple, unassuming, but Katie could feel the weight of it in the air. Roland gestured to the box. "Your inheritance, Nathaniel. It's all in there. The truth, the plans, everything you need to understand." Nathaniel's eyes flickered from Roland to the box, his face a mask of determination. He reached for it, slowly lifting the lid. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was a set of documents, old, yellowed papers. And beneath them, a small, ornate key. It was a key that looked far too familiar, a key that had been mentioned countless times in whispers and secretive conversations. Nathaniel's hand hovered over the key, the realization dawning on him like a heavy weight. This was it, the final piece of his family's legacy. His connection to everything he had despised, everything he had fought against. "I won't follow in your footsteps," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering as he closed the box. "I won't become the man you want me to be." Roland's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of something, perhaps annoyance, perhaps fear, crossing his features. But he quickly recovered, his composure returning. "We'll see about that, won't we?" Katie could feel the air crackling with tension. She knew they were nearing the end of this twisted game, but the path ahead was still unclear. All they could do now was confront the truth and fight for their future, no matter the cost. Nathaniel stood up, the box still in his hands. He looked at Roland one last time, his gaze steady and resolute. "This ends now," Nathaniel declared. And with that, they turned, walking out of the room, leaving behind the legacy of lies and corruption and stepping into a new world, one where their future could finally be their own. The starlit promise had been made, and it would be kept.